Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Hrund Gunnsteinsdottir. Uh, I'll tell you all about Hrund in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment. We sometimes overlook it. Intuition is a key part of that, and we're going to explore that with Hrund in just a minute. But Grace Under Pressure focuses on how to bring people together for common cause and learn about each other and understand each other in new and different ways. Welcome, Hrund Gunnsteinsdottir.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
I want to tell folks about you. Hrund Gunnsteinsdottir is an Icelandic thought leader. She's a conflict resolution expert and works with the UN. And she has a new book out, which is what we're going to talk about today. It's called InnSæi, The Power of Intuition. Hrund brings a unique perspective to this topic and how we lead, live, and innovate. She's a firm believer that change we now need in the world starts, guess where? From inside of us. She's learned this as a post-conflict reconstruction activist or expert in the UN in Europe and Asia. She's also a serial entrepreneur and done a whole bunch of stuff. But right now she is based in Berlin. And welcome to the show, Hrund Gunnsteinsdottir.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you, John.
Now, intuition is the theme of your book, InnSæi, Heal, Revive, Reset with Icelandic Art of Intuition. Okay, that's a topic that the intuition part, a lot of us know something about. Give us the slant that you bring from your Icelandic heritage.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great place to start our conversation. So I started to really delve into intuition and what it is from a very hard place. I was in my late 20s and I experienced what we might perhaps today call a burnout. I didn't know the word then, but it was hitting a wall. So professionally, personally, I collapsed physically and just really had to rethink my direction in life. And the only way out for me was to seek within. So this is when I really deeply connected with intuition and what it is. And then one thing led to another for a few years. And I would do a lot of research. I would dive deeply into, the wisdom we have, science, psychology, the practice behind intuition. And I did a lot of practice to support my own healing back into the world, so to speak. And I also had the amazing opportunity to speak and converse with a lot of people from all over the world, mostly in English, because that was the way that we communicated beyond Iceland at the time. And unfortunately, I don't speak more languages as well as English. And what really struck me was that, speaking with professors in universities and in cognitive behavioral science or spiritual leaders and shamans and world-renowned artists, explorers, and just regular folks like myself, I realized that we have different ways of defining intuition. So a spectrum kind of emerged, and it's intuition from being an irrational impulse we should never rely on, to being something woo-woo that hasn't been backed by science. And then in between all of these, and I guess mixing these two extremes together as well to some extent, I would just find all these amazing research stories and practice-based stories of the role that intuition plays and how fundamental it is to our intelligence. It's not just one small part of our intellectual infrastructure. It's actually fundamental to it. So after having done all this and sort of traveled the world, partly mentally, partly physically, to unearth intuition, it just brought me back to my native country, Iceland. And I saw the Icelandic word for intuition for the first time. And it's just I find it very profound, and there's so much wisdom embedded in the word. So for the listeners to try to understand what I mean here. So Iceland, in Iceland, we speak Icelandic. There is less than 400,000 people that inhabit Iceland. We are very protective of our language. And for modern Icelanders, we can more or less read Old Norse because Icelandic hasn't changed that much.
Right.
So when we adopt new words for new developments, new innovations, new things in the world, then we create a specific Icelandic word that describes the function of the thing that we are trying to translate. So when intuition was brought into the Icelandic language, 1900 something, can't remember exactly the year, then there was this man, Sigurður Nordal, who sat down and thought, let me think about what this means and how we can find its way into the Icelandic language. And the word he came up with was InnSæi. And InnSæi is put together of two words, is in, which means inside or into, and sæi means to see or the sea. And so having worked with this word in education and the documentary film and lots of different things, and especially when we did the documentary film, we really opened up this word, looking at it from how it's put together. So to your question, so the way that InnSæi, if you think about the function of the word, it is telling us that intuition has a threefold meaning in Icelandic. It means the sea within, and that refers to our ever-evolving dynamic unconsciousness, which is constantly flowing, making new connections. It's the inner world beyond words. It's the world of imagination, connections. And if you put the sea within into boxes or silos, it ceases to flow. I think that's very important for our context here. And then secondly, InnSæi, the concept means to see within. And that has to do with the first step you take when you want to understand your intuition, which is self-awareness, metacognition, the ability to see inside yourself so that you can put yourself in other people's shoes, but also importantly, so that you're able to discern intuition from biases and fears and wishful thinking. And then thirdly, the InnSæi concept means to see from the inside out, and that has to do with navigating your authentic way in the turbulent world or the ocean of life.
Well, what an extraordinary answer. So it's so encompassing, all encompassing, so much to unpack. But before we delve further, I wanted to dig into, because you talked about story and a little about myth and different cultures that you explore. So your own heritage, or Icelandic heritage, is the Norse. And we know of the Norse heritage through the myths, which were the gods and the battles they had, not unlike the Greek gods and Roman gods, different names, of course. but what's the connection there, do you think, the mythology of your culture and how that relates to InnSæi?
Well, I love this question, and there's also lots of things in there. There's first of all mythology, secondly Norse mythology, and then what I take from your question is also the close relationship that we have with nature. So when I was growing up in Iceland, we wouldn't talk about intuition, not that I remember. But we were always talking about stories of how nature guided us, or like our grandparents, like when they had to walk across 2 fjords when they were 5 years old, and they put themselves on the way and they were lost in the darkness. There was no light anywhere, like in the beginning of the last century, stuff like that. And then they would see a light in the hill and they would follow the light right back home, and nobody could explain what the story was behind that. So nature speaks to you, it guides you. We like, I grew up with that kind of storytelling that was just embedded in my body, and also just the descriptions that we use. If any of your listeners have read Icelandic novels or fiction, then you will, or my book, then you will see how we use nature to describe how things function, look, and feel, and all these different things. When I hear your question about Norse mythology, I go back to Odin, the god, the great god, and also the goddesses. So Odin, the god of in Norse mythology, he went out on a limb. He sacrificed his eye, and he hung from a tree for 9 days. He sacrificed his body in order to gain deeper intuition insights into things, and to be able to see what is intangible, what's on the horizon, on the periphery of things. And there are stories of how he would work with the goddesses to try to deepen his own intuition into things. And he had these two ravens on both of his shoulders, which referred to the mind, and then the memory, or the body memory. So it's all in there. And in my book, I do recollect this memory of being in school as a kid, and our teacher teaching us Norse mythology and paganism and belief in nature, and telling us that this old belief that we are part of nature and nature is part of us, and it's really hard to tangle the things apart. And so I always remember this story when the teacher said, you have to be, according to this belief, you have to be careful what you say out loud, because if you say your thoughts out loud, the stone will hear it, and the bird will sit on the stone, and the stone will tell the bird, and then the bird will fly to a tree. And you can just imagine when the bird tells the tree, because it has so many branches, and it will tell all the rest of the birds, and this is how things become into reality. And then in the book, I also connected to old spiritual beliefs, but also quantum physics. So there are things that vibrate throughout human history, and they appear in different shapes and forms throughout the centuries, but we are often telling the same story, right? And intuition is very much about tuning into that. And the way that I see InnSæi as the word to reframe our understanding of intuition today is because it holds space for both the timeless and ancient wisdom, but also for most recent discoveries in science and everything in between.
Okay. Now let's get specific with your book, because there are 3 C's in InnSæi. The C, as in spelled as the sea, the ocean. There's the C as in sight, and then the intuition inside out. So talk about the C within, and you talked about the flow. How does that manifest itself within us, Hrund?
Yeah, so one of the ways to talk about that is, we have consciousness. Not every culture on the planet divides consciousness into sub, under, and consciousness. It's just consciousness, but we do. So in my book, I talk about the unconscious and consciousness. So in our very focused conscious mind, we recite about, let's say, 1 to 5% of all consciousness. So most of the things that we are picking up with our whole body and sensory data throughout every minute of every day is picked up by our unconsciousness. And this is what intuition taps into when it guides us. So sometimes we say that it's knowing without knowing, and it's not quite capturing the whole science behind intuition. So a way to talk about the sea within in a very practical way, to your question, is to talk about the flow state. So being in the zone, losing track of time, being absolutely engaged in an activity, is something that we call being in a flow state. And I think it was Johann Hari who said, flow state is the highest form of attention humans can give. And so when we're in a flow state, this is also where our genius manifests itself, in the sense that we perform better than when we are absent-minded, let's say, or we are not in a flow, we are not connected within. So to me, a flow state is also about being aligned with your intuition. And what is also important for our conversation is to say that, in simple terms, when we are in a flow state, what happens is that our critical voice in the mind, which we all have, at least most of us, the editor, the doubter, the over-analytical, the logical brain who's asking, why are you doing this now? Somebody else must have done it before, blah, blah, blah. It just steps aside. It leaves us all to the task, and it puts us into this flow, like the circulation system of our mind, brain, body, soul, heart. The whole system is working hand in hand to solve an issue, problem, or create something.
Now, from that, the C within, SEA, as in water, there's also the C as in vision, and that's what you attribute the sense of self-awareness. And
Yes.
self-awareness is very, a colleague of ours, Tasha Urich, has done great studies on self-awareness. And it's hard. We think we know ourselves, but really we don't. So what's your perspective on that, Hrund?
Yeah, this is a great question. So just to say from the start, exactly, when we talk about self-awareness is fundamental to starting to even think about your intuition and how your intuition works. We all have intuition, and it's absolutely up to us to tune into it. And it starts by knowing what this ecosystem is that is me. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Having
Mhm.
said that, I don't think it's sensible to think that we can know ourselves completely. I also want to remind people all the time, and I also do this in my book, is to say that intuition comes with humility, in the sense that we human beings, we don't know that much about consciousness, brain, or intuition in general. Our knowledge thereon is growing really fast, but we don't know everything about it. We're far from it. Knowledge, psychological knowledge about self-awareness is constantly changing. So there's humility in this. When I say self-awareness is super important, and it's not to know yourself 100% and that you have to understand how everybody experiences you. What I always advise people to do is to start with journaling. But just to mention one small thing when it comes to self-awareness, so we think thousands of thoughts during a single day. We are aware of a tiny fraction of all the thoughts that we think. And yet our thoughts that we think to ourselves are probably the most important thoughts that we think, that are the thoughts that we think about ourselves, is what I wanted to say, are probably the most important thoughts that we think, because they shape how we show up, how we understand other people, how we find our place in the world. So just trying to capture some of these thoughts and how we pay attention to the world around us is a very good and important first step to start to really understand where is intuition, where is this conflicting thoughts and overthinking and fears and biases and so on.
Now we've gone through this inner, and now we're ready, inner exploration, intuition, and also this consciousness within us that we all possess. Then we get, this is so Icelandic to me, or at least Norse, navigation, our compass, where we're going. And so how developing that developing that inner compass, is this, as you described the compass, is that a moral compass? Is it our ethics, or how do you describe it, Hrund?
So the way that, one of the ways to start describing is to say, like, if you have ever felt, and this is to the listeners, if you've ever felt aligned, like if you can right now recall a moment when you really felt aligned with your intuition, you just knew what was the right thing to do in the moment, or you just knew what was the wrong thing to do in the moment. This alignment is very often embodied intelligence, like you feel it in your body. This is your inner compass showing up for you. So when you ask if it's moral or ethical, it's a combination of your morals, your ethics, how you think about things, how you want to show up in the world, what is aligned with your values, your ethics, your interests, your passions, and so on and so forth. The way that I started to think about inner compass is, because you mentioned in the beginning, I come from a world of, complex emergencies, peace and conflict, international relations. I also went into exploring the fourth industrial revolution, technological revolution, future foresight, all these different things. And I started to just think about, like, if there's anything that's certain about the world we live in, it is that it is very uncertain. So I'm a person who thinks very visually, maybe because I come from an island. And so I started to think about the world we live in like an ocean. So just imagine we are out on the ocean. It's vast. There is no land in sight. And we're just by ourselves on the ocean. So there's two rules. Rule number one is to keep your head up, otherwise you drown. Okay. And then rule number two is to decide in which direction to go to. And that's a much harder one. And I think that's a question that a lot of us are contemplating dealing with in the world today. And the greatest expertise that we can ever hone to answer such questions comes from within us. And this is what we know from ancient science. This is what we know from resilience studies and leadership studies and psychological studies, is that inner security, our ability to trust our own judgment, our ability to understand when we can rely on our intuition and when not, is super important. And you know, when I say this now to you, John, it makes me think about when I started really researching intuition 20 plus years ago. It took me a long time to voice what I was thinking, because I had been really well trained in our best universities and international workplaces not to talk about stuff like that. So I think naming intuition is super important, because we as humans, leaders, kids, you know, just whatever we are, however we show up in the world, intuition is guiding us a lot of the time. But if we're not aligned and connected with it, it can feel very draining. We can feel very lost because it's doing it anyway. So it's even more important that we tune into it in the world that we live in today.
That resonates with me. And at the very beginning, you were talking about, I've done over 280 of these interviews, and you're the only person that ever mentioned shaman. So I thought, okay, this is going to be different. But what you just touched on is something non-Western, certainly. It's non-linear thought. And with your culture, as you told me about your grandparents and Icelandic culture being tied to nature. So then how do we tune, we're urban, so many of us are urban focused, we live in communities. How do we tap into a natural rhythm? What is your advice for us, Hrund?
So I like to talk about the two rhythms and a sharper inner compass. So a way for us to hone and harness and align with our intuition as we go through the days and weeks and years and the world we live in today is to think about ourselves as being combined of two different rhythms. So one is the rhythm of being, receiving, intuiting, you know, having intuition, being creative, being in the flow. The other rhythm is the rhythm of organizing, planning, manipulating, which is really, really necessary for humans in order to survive and thrive, right? But what is happening to us now in the stress and speed and the overemphasis on like tiny fraction of the world we live in, as opposed to seeing the big context of things and how everything is interconnected, is that we are out of joint when it comes to having a balance between these two rhythms. So if you're a neuroscientist, you would probably say we are in a fight or flight mode all the time. We need to be more, not as tunnel viewed, but more open-minded. You know, some people would say we need to connect heads to hearts. You know, we need divergent thought and convergent thought. There's so many different ways that our disciplines and cultures explain this. And this is why I do mention shaman, because in my work, I'm very intentional about honoring the different schools of thoughts and knowledge that we have on planet Earth, because we really need that renaissance, in my view, because we are kind of stumbling on our very rational, you know, analytical, detailed mind and losing sense of the big context. So what I advise people, and I do this also as a coach, and I've done this in education programs, is how do you learn to hone and harness and find balance between these two rhythms, like really in the meeting that you're in. It's not like you have to take 1 or 3 hours a day to meditate. It's, you know, it's how do you go with that flow? Because sometimes we are under pressure. Sometimes we do need to be super focused and analytical and in a fight or flight mode, for sure. But then we need to know how to go back and fill our tanks again, so that we don't burn our candle on both ends, but also so that we don't sacrifice the wealth of intelligence that humans have in our whole being and in all of our brain, you know. So in order to work the best with the intelligence that we have.
Right. Now I'm going to throw you a curveball question.
All right, go for
So
it.
intuition is vital, is part of our humanness. How can we? What happens when our intuition is wrong? What strategies do we have for dealing with that? What's your perspective, Hrund? So
So just to say, intuition is not always right. Intuition is not always correct. And the same goes for statistics and strategy and most other things, just to keep that kind of in an equilibrium. When our intuition is wrong, it's good to learn from it, right? You
yeah.
know, and it's really that. It's we humility again. Learn from mistakes, whether your judgment is based on intuition or biases or data that wasn't covering the whole spectrum. Learn from your experience. That's really how I would answer that question.
Oh, that's wonderful. And it kind of harkens back to what you talked about, the Norse god Odin. And I
Yeah.
did not know that he seemed to be, if my a seeker, someone
Yeah.
exploring. And when I think of Roman god or Greek gods, and later the Romans, I didn't see a lot of self-awareness in there. They just kind of were what they were, But I like this
It's
idea of
interesting, right?
exploration. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it makes me curious about that. Exactly. I thought about that too.
uh,
We need to delve deeper
uh,
into that
Great.
world.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Ron, this is a fascinating conversation. As you know, I ask every guest on the show a story about grace. And do you have one you would like to share with us?
So this is such a wonderful question, and the way that I want to approach the question is to say I have witnessed grace so often in my life in other people. And I think it's one of the most beautiful ways of showing up in the world. Grace to me is the spine is always straight. It's funny how I think, I want to make sure my spine is straight when I talk about grace.
Yeah.
It describes a person that sits comfortably in him or herself, in self.
Mm-hmm.
It describes a person who has an open heart. It describes a person who is okay in being there for the greater good and not just for their ego. It describes a person that thinks really long term. So it would be somebody who is going through a terribly hard divorce or relationship at work or whatever, and says, you know what, can we just decide that we are going to remain friends until we die? And then we take it from there. To me, that's grace.
Yeah. Wonderful. I love that exploration. You touched on so many inner sense, the calmness, how we manifest ourselves to others, and then most importantly, how we interact with others. And so
Yes.
that is such an important part of grace. So Hrund Gunnsteinsdottir, it's such a pleasure to have you. The name of your book is InnSæi, InnSæi, Heal, Revive, Reset with the Icelandic Art of Intuition. It's a mouthful, but it's very accessible. So how can we find you, Hrund?
So you can find me on my website, which is my full name.com, hrundgunnsteinsdottir.com. Maybe you will share that in the show notes.
Definitely.
I'm also active on LinkedIn and Instagram, and I will be offering some courses shortly for people who want to train aligning and honing their intuition through the Icelandic lens of InnSæi. Yeah.
Right. Hrund, it's been such a pleasure just to speak to you. And with that, we will go out.
Thank you so much, John. Such a pleasure to speak with you too.